Good afternoon,
Yes.
sir. Leslie Thomas and I appear with Junior Counsel Thalia Mirage. We're currently instructed to represent 17 people, 17 core participants, including bereaved families, former residents of the tower, residents of the walkway, and also a survivor who was neither a resident of the tower or the walkway, but was visiting a friend on the night of the fire. I'm instructed by 3 firms of solicitors: Hudgell's, Saunders Solicitors and James Solicitors. Last week we indicated to you, sir, that we were going to divide up some of the topics. The topic that I would like to address you on, or topics I would like to address you on, are experts, which has been touched upon already.
Yes.
And also, I want to come back to the theme of diversity.
Yes, we will.
Sir, it goes without saying that we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the victim core participants, should be at the heart of this process. And in a way, that very much informs the approach that we, when I say we, those of us who represent victim core participants, approach the question of expert evidence. And I say that for the following reasons. Fundamental to the process of the inquiry is the equality of arms. We want to be in a position whereby at the end of this inquiry, we can say to our clients, well, you know, regardless of the result, regardless of the decision, you had a fair crack of the whip. Just pause for one moment, and I say that respectfully, and consider that. We already know that some of the corporate core participants have already started the process of engaging their own experts. How do we know that? Well, they've said so. They've said so in their submissions to you. The one thing that you know, sir, that those who we represent, our pockets do not run deep. Therefore, we are very much dependent on you and your team to ensure that we are given a fair crack of the whip when it comes to the question of experts. Because, yes, it's right that a lot of your inquiry will be taken up with the personal accounts, the personal histories, the stories as to what happened on that night. But a lot of that will be informed by the advice given by experts. So, let me turn to experts. It's important that we have meaningful participation in the process of experts. And for there to be meaningful participation, it's right and it's important that we have disclosure, and we have disclosure early. So you can't put the cart before the horse. To be able to instruct experts properly, we need the documents. Why do we need the documents? Because we want to be able to ask the right questions of the expert. Now, that doesn't mean that we need all the documents, but we certainly need more documents than we have at the moment, which is none. Yeah? So that's really important. And it cannot be lost on you, or indeed your team, that if your aim is to be fair, ensure a full process, a meaningful engagement, there are certain steps that need to be taken before other steps. And I'm not going to address you on disclosure because that was done already this morning and you know what the arguments are. But it is important that disclosure cannot be looked at in isolation. It runs hand in hand with the instructions of experts. I'm glad to see, and a lot of my steam was taken away when your counsel this morning gave an indication that many of the concerns that we had are going to be addressed, and we thank you for that. I'm glad to see that the expert CVs will be provided, that we will have more time to have input in terms of the letters of instructions, so that there can be more meaningful engagement in that process. Can I touch, sir, upon some additional and further experts that we would invite you to consider? So I've already told you, on behalf of the victim core participants, of our need to play a full role in this process. Let me add a little bit more meat to the bones when it comes to experts, and you'll see why. In terms of asking questions, and indeed in terms of knowing whether or not all the disclosure, or the right disclosure, or whether things may have been missed, hidden, disappeared, who knows? We needed expert input into that. We would invite you, sir, to also consider the following expertise or expert opinion on housing construction, that being separate and distinct from refurbishment and maintenance. What you tend to find, sir, is those who are engaged in large-scale projects such as housing construction don't normally deal with the maintenance afterwards. It tends to be separate. And therefore, having an expert in the construction, we would invite you to have a separate expert in terms of once the building has been constructed, how it therefore is maintained. Because you tend to find that, I'm not talking about small projects, I'm talking about a large-scale project. And so I see you understand the point I'm making. In terms of the refurbishment and maintenance, we subdivide that even further. It's important to note that this is not purely about the refurbishment programme, but also can be divided into three areas. Those three areas are as follows. Firstly, the original construction. Secondly, whether there was a need for other works after the original construction. And finally, we would invite you to consider the 2012 to 2016 programme of works that was undertaken. We submit that it's very much doubted that a single expert could address all of those issues. So we would invite you to consider in this inquiry the use of an independent environmental health expert. We suggest that sort of expertise is needed in a case such as this. We'd also invite you to consider an expert in the management of the aftermath of a disaster, which may have been touched upon this morning. If it has, forgive me, I repeat it. I think it's worth underscoring the point. The final thing I'm going to say about experts before I move on to the second area, because a lot has already been said and I don't want to be repetitious, is the importance that there is a proper timetable put into play which gives us a proper opportunity to consider documents, consider the disclosure and make meaningful and timely submissions to you and your team. You would expect that in every other legal process. Why should this inquiry be any different?
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I'm hoping that perhaps on the next occasion we meet for directions, you can put a timetable of that sort into place with everyone's contributions.
I would hope so too. A lot will very much depend, sir, on the first stage, which is getting some disclosure so that we can put some meaning to that timetable. So can I move on to some other matters? The second topic that I wanted to touch upon was diversity.
Yes.
The one thing, sir, that must trouble you at night when you close your eyes before you lay your head down on that pillow is, what will my legacy be?
Now, I can assure you, Mr. Thomas, that that never troubles me.
I'm not going to suggest it should do. But let's just look at that question. What will my legacy be at the end of this inquiry? And I want to look at that in the context of diversity. And so I make no apologies for what I'm about to say, because one of the things that will not be lost on you or anybody else who sits in this inquiry, you can see most of the victim call participants because they're sitting right at the back. You couldn't get a more diverse group of people. Now look at the lawyers. Look at the lawyers who represent predominantly, because the way you've divided us, look at the lawyers who represent predominantly the corporate call participants. And even to an extent, look at those of us who represent the victim call participants. Fairly homogenised group, wouldn't you agree? Apart from the odd exception here and there. What must they be thinking in terms of, are we going to get justice? Do they understand us? That is why, sir, the submissions that were made to you about the panel, the representation on the panel, this isn't just lip service. This isn't saying, I want somebody who looks like me for the sake of somebody who looks like me. No, it's much more than that. Does this inquiry pass the smell test? What is the smell test on an inquiry such as this? Well, I've already said look at the suits. I've already told you to look at the victim call participants. I've asked you to take a long, hard look at your panel, your assessors, your team, and ask yourself, does it pass the smell test? Because that relates to perception, public perception. Do they understand us? Do they speak our language? Do they know anything about social housing? How many of them have lived in a tower block or on a council estate, or in social housing. That affects confidence. Confidence, or a lack of it, affects participation. And a lack of participation from the very people who matter will affect justice. And a lack of justice is injustice. That's all I have to say, sir. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your submissions.